Hey everyone, welcome to Keto and Crime. Today I have the story of Otto Adolf Eichmann. If there was anyone except for Hendrik who actually came up with the whole idea of the final solution, there was ever anybody who will be getting this on video, but Eichmann worked with Hendrik, also some other big Nazi leaders. He was the logistics, the planning, the map maker for the final solution. And we all know what that refers to. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, as well as millions of other people that the Nazis thought were not fit to live. Gypsies, the disabled, the severely sick, elderly in some circumstances, and homosexuals, as well as any non-white, non-German descended Slav. And those are people that occupy the Eastern European front. Everybody from Poland to Serbia to Russia to Ukraine, they're all from Slavic descent. And so he is the one. He is the one that orchestrated that whole solution from soup to nuts. He was the one behind it, and that's who we're going to talk about today on Keto and Crime as our study of the Third Reich continues. Adolf was the eldest of 5 children. He was born in Austria in 1906 to a Calvinist family by the name of Adolf and Maria Eichmann. Adolf worked for he's a commercial manager. He was an office professional, and his wife Maria was a housewife. There were 5 children total, with Adolf being the oldest. Now, in 1916, his mother Maria passed away, so he would have been 10 years old. And his father, needing help, and I'm sure because it was the German way to always have a complete family, his father married a woman, ironically, with the same name, Maria 𝗬𝗏, and she was also a devout Protestant, more of a Lutheran, who had 2 sons. And she raised all of the Eichmann children in an uber-religious setting. Eichmann attended the Kaiser Franz Joseph Secondary School in Linz, Austria. And basically, this is the same school that Adolf Hitler attended. So he was involved in a lot of different things. He was a pretty talented violinist, and I had a subscriber mention to me the other day, what would have happened if Hitler had made it as an artist, if Bormann had had success as a farmer, if Himmler had had success as a farmer. Would this whole tragedy been avoided? And I think it would have. I think it would have. If only there had been just a few twists and turns, I think all of World War II, and especially the Holocaust, could have been avoided. But anyway, he was active in sports and clubs. He was good woodcraft and was in scouting, working his way all the way up to the equivalent of an Eagle Scout. Even though Adolf was talented in extracurriculars, working with his hands, he played the violin, the woodworking, the doing all the tasks that scouts have to do, he wasn't such a good student. He flunked out of secondary school, and his father pretty much got mad and jerked him out of there and sent him to a vocational college. Young man, go learn a trade. But he did end up quitting there after about a year. He did not get a degree, but he did join his father's new mining company, which he had just started, and he ended up working for his father for about 6 months, and did okay, but he wanted to strike out on his own. So in 1925, he worked as a sales clerk for the AG radio company, and then he worked for the vacuum oil company as a general office person, just like his father, an office professional, for a time. During this time, just like a lot of young Germans who had become disenfranchised, this is again after World War I with Germany, the Weimar Republic not doing so well, Well, I take that back. The Weimar Republic, even though they had a lot of reparations to pay, the 1920s, because of the growth that everyone experienced, every capitalist nation experienced, and even some that weren't capitalist experienced during the 20s, um, Germany was doing quite well economically, but because of the huge amount of reparations they had to pay, and the fact that they were required to keep their military at 100,000 men or less, and the fact they weren't allowed to have an air force, and that they had to surrender some of their lands in Czechoslovakia and other areas, the morale of Germany wasn't doing so good. And just like a lot of young men and a lot of war veterans, he got sucked into some right-wing militia groups. Now, there's always a lot of discussion on, is fascism right-wing or left-wing? Does it have more in common with communism or capitalism? Well, first of all, I'm happy to do a comparison video on communism versus fascism, but it's kind of like apples and oranges. Fascism is a totalitarian type of government, whereas communism and capitalism are economic theories. So fascism, especially how it was practiced in Europe, think Mussolini, think Hitler, it is basically a totalitarian type of government control where everything's for the good of the state. It looks as people being bound by blood and soil. And I know that brings back a lot of bad memories of some marches in the United States, not about 5 years, actually, what, oh God, 7 years ago. So it's basically based on you give up individual rights to move the state forward, and any ends justifies the means for the good of the state. Now, who defines what's good for the state? The leaders of the fascist government defines what's good for the state, and that's where we get into trouble. So just because Germany was a capitalist economy at the time does not mean that fascism is linked to capitalism. You could also look at Stalin, at Mao. Those are very fascist, totalitarian types of regimes where everything's for the good of China, for the good of Mother Russia, and they had varied types of economics. They were both communist. So fascism can be linked to both communism, socialism, or capitalism. So don't automatically think that fascism is a capitalist thing, because it doesn't. Your economy is kind of irrelevant, because the fascist government is going to use that economy to the best of their abilities. So yeah, fascism is a form of government, whereas the others are political. And if you want me to do a whole thing, I'll be happy to. But anyway, like a lot of young Germans, he ended up joining these right-wing militia groups. And of course, because he was in these, junior right-wing fascist for the good of Germany militia groups, that led him to the German National Socialist Workers' Party, or the Nazis. He began reading their propaganda newspapers, and he kind of glomped on to their overall policy or platform of wanting to destroy the Weimar Republic, reject that Treaty of Versailles. They blamed the Jews or anybody that they thought did not live up to German standards, like communists, like gypsies, like Slavs, like homosexuals, like anybody that wasn't physically or mentally perfect. So, yeah, and again, that's, I think, where, fascism is automatically linked with capitalism, because the Nazis were so anti-communism, but it's not the case. You can be fascist and communist, fascist and capitalist. And that's all I'll say about that, unless you want me to do a video. Comment down below. Now, because he was Austrian, and Austria was kind of considered the sister of Germany, Austria was kind of affected in the same way Germany was. So, Adolf Hitler was also Austrian. So anything that affected Germany affected Austria. But Austria passed a law saying no foreign political parties in Austria. So that kind of did away with the Nazis being able to expand into Austria around 1932. But they did start a Nazi-like Austrian branch in 1932, and Eichmann joined it. He was member number 889,895. He also joined the SS, where he was member number 45,326, and he was a member of SS Regiment 37, which he was responsible for guarding the Austrian branch of the Nazi Party in Linz, Austria. He also continued to work for Vacuum Oil. And then in 1933, the Nazis seized power in Germany through both everything you've seen, ballot harvesting, negotiation with other conservative right-wingers, moderates, and then convincing the president to make Adolf Hitler the chancellor. There's a whole thing that we'll go over when we go over Hitler. But basically, the Nazis are now in charge. Then, again, Austrian government found out that there was this Nazi-like party in Austria and, again, banned it and dissolved it. So all of Eichmann's extracurriculars were cut off, and he was a big one on extracurriculars. He also lost his job at Vacuum Oil because of the destabilization of the region, with the Nazis taking over. So he decided, I'm going to go back to Mother Germany. As again, he was born in Austria, spent most of his life in Austria. He was the child of Germans. So he decided to go to Germany and ended up in the city of Passau, where he rejoined the SS. He went to the SS depot there and actually decided to remain at the Passau border between Austria and Germany as a member of the SS and direct other Nazis who were fleeing Austria, as now their party is illegal, and returning to Germany. So he was promoted up to a squad leader and eventually a corporal, and I think that's the highest rank Hitler ever achieved. He basically was right there next to the Dachau concentration camp. Now, concentration camps had been around for a long time. Most of them were in Germany or right on the border of Austria. You didn't see places like Sobibor, Auschwitz, until they expanded and took over places of like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. But there were concentration camps, and they were mainly used for housing political prisoners, criminals, just anybody that the Nazis didn't like. And they were mainly labor and prison camps at the time. There wasn't a whole lot of extermination going on until a little bit later, until they got a crafty idea. And so basically he was stationed there, but of course it was a labor and a lot of slave labor. A lot of German and Austrian companies contracted with the Nazi government to produce goods at zero cost, almost just whatever fees they paid the Nazis to use slave labor at some of these plants. Think Volkswagen, think the company that produced Zyklon B, think Adidas. A lot of the companies that we know and treasure today had Nazi ties. And I'm not saying you should go out and boycott those companies. Things happen, people change. We don't know what kind of pressures they were under. But a lot of these concentration camps were used for that purpose before they became extermination camps. In late 1934, Eichmann requested a transfer from the overbroad SS to the security and espionage component of the SS known as the SD. And he ended up receiving that transfer and went into the sub-office on Freemasons. Yes, they even hated Freemasons, like a lot of people still do today, and I happen to know some Freemasons. I work for some Freemasons, and they're nice people. Do I think that they're out to destroy the world? No. They're just like a lot of clubs and fraternities. They had an iffy start, but do I think there's some kind of worldwide conspiracy? No. But again, Freemasons, just like homosexuals, Jews, and gypsies, were a no-no for the Nazis. Eichmann, for the SD, started following and reporting on the activities of known Freemasons and Freemason lodges. They created an anti-Masonic exhibit at a Nazi museum, which proved to be quite popular. And then he was transferred to Berlin. he would spend a great part of his career moving back and forth between countries and cities. And he was transferred to the Jewish department. And so he started doing the same things that he was doing on the Masonic Lodge to Jews, tracking them, learning their habits, recording them. It's just like they would do the equivalent of a census, and they would figure out who was all Jewish, and they would have them on a list. It's kind of like the opposite of Schindler's List. The list wasn't life, the list was death. And so Eichmann was part of that. During this time, he also married his longtime girlfriend, Vera Liebel. They ended up having 4 sons: Klaus, Adolf, Dieter, and Ricardo, who was actually born after the war in Argentina, but we'll get to that. He was promoted to the head of the anti-Jewish department and continued to extract as much data on Germany's Jews as he possibly could. He also stopped attending church in 1937. Remember, the Nazis were pretty much occultists or atheists. They didn't believe in God. They believed that the church, particularly the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church, were huge obstacles for them to overcome, because it gave the people of Germany and Austria more to glomp onto than just the Führer. So they started trying to wreck religion as well. During the early part of this, before the invasion of Poland in 1939, where everything went ham, their major component was to get the Jews from Germany out of Germany. They wanted them out. Between 1933 and 1939, they had managed to push them out. About 250,000 of the country's 400,000 Jews left willingly. They didn't care where they went. They just wanted them out. This is before they decided, on mass extermination and things like that. They just wanted them gone. And part of Eichmann's job was to not only put the pressure on, and they did this by passing the Nuremberg laws and other laws that basically said, you have to, you can't hire a Jew. Jews can't hire non-Jews. There's taxes. Insurance companies would swindle them and not pay on claims. There was Kristallnacht. There was all kinds of things that happened before it ever got to the point of mass extermination and segregation. So a lot of Jews saw the writing on the wall and got the heck out, and I don't blame them. But part of his job was to find a place for them to go, and he ended up doing some touring in the Middle East, especially British Mandatory Palestine, and thought that it might be a good idea to get them to the Middle East. There was also the idea, he was one of the major players in the Madagascar plan, which was the plan to put all of Europe's Jews, not just the Nazis had plans for all of Europe and the entire world, not just Germany and then Austria to begin with. They had plans, and part of that was getting the Jews away from them, and they decided that Madagascar, which is in the Indian Ocean on the east coast of Africa, would be a good place. They were going to set up a prison state that, even though it would be self-governing, it would be guarded so that they couldn't get off. So once you got there, can't leave. It's like the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't check out. So they were looking to basically move all of the Jews there, but that was quite dependent on their success. Even though the war had not officially started, they were still doing land grabs, and that part of that was in Africa. Their hopes was they would be able to defeat the British, take over the Suez Canal, and that would give them the leeway they need to get all the Jews to Madagascar. Of course, we know that fell through because British held on to their colonies. So step 1, get them out of Germany. Step 2, get them out of Austria. They didn't care where they went. Step 3, get them out of Europe. Those were the 3 things. That was the Jewish question. How do we get rid of them? And, well, we know. But basically, this was the United States, Canada, everybody in North America, South America, limited the number of Jews they would take, as did the rest of Europe. So the Jews were kind of in a pickle. So a lot of them did leave voluntarily. They did get into other European countries, but a lot of them went to the Middle East. So you got to feel really, really bad for these people. And then there was the unification of Germany and Austria. had now another few 100,000 Jews to contend with, and it was also around this time the Reich passed laws that said that Jewish wealth could not be transferred. So not only were they forcing these people out, they were keeping their money. So how are these people supposed to go anywhere? So it was just kind of, okay, give me everything you got, now you can leave. It was sort of like that. And so, but under his pressure, as I said, 250,000 German Jews and about 100,000 Austrian Jews immigrated out and ended up in the Middle East or elsewhere. And then with the invasion of Poland, he had more Jews to contend with, Polish Jews, plus any German or Austrian Jews that had immigrated there, and the policy went from forced immigration to forced deportation. Now all those lists, he was in charge of making all the lists and registries that he had made in Germany and Austria and all the invaded territories. It was now that they were literally arresting, holding, and forcibly taking possessions and throwing Jews out of Poland. So that was his deal. He oversaw all that. He oversaw the camps where they were held and until they were inspected and then sent on their way. From what we know, he was able to arrange the deportation of about 80,000 Polish Jews during this time frame. And then they decided to segregate, and this is where the ghettos in a lot of major cities, particularly Warsaw, Poland, were created, and the Jews that were still there were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to utter squalor, walled off from the rest of the population. And that's where they held them until they decided what to do. And this, of course, is, they're still hoping for Madagascar, and then it kind of, fizzles out because Germany wasn't doing so good in their African campaign. And then enter June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, which was Hitler's breaking of his treaty with the Communist Soviet Union, and they invaded Russia. And so with all of the territory that they captured from Russia, they also inherited more Jewish people. So now the question becomes, okay, we've got them out of Germany, we got them out of Austria, we've got them segregated in Poland, now we've got all these Russian Jews. Well, the ones that the army didn't kill in very graphic, gruesome manner during their military campaigns, they were left with quite a problem. And it was then that 𝗍𝗵, who was in charge of the SD, told Eichmann that Hitler, and this was at a conference known as the 𝗍𝗂𝘁cie conference, where all the heavy hitters of the Nazi Party was there, that Hitler had decreed that all European Jews, those that hadn't made it to the Middle East, would be terminated. And so now they just had to come up with a way to cleanly do that. And it started with firing squads. They would take tons of Jews, no matter where they were located, take them out, particularly this was happening in the Soviet Union, and just shoot them. In Poland, they would kidnap or take Jews from the ghetto, transfer them into wooded areas where no one was around, and they would shoot them. But as you can imagine, this is causing quite a drain on resources, and it was handed over to Eichmann to come up with a way to more cleanly and economically do this. And then you had the transformation of the prison camps, and particularly the ones in Poland, away from the general population's eyes. 𝗙𝗵𝗁, Treblinka, and then later on Auschwitz-Birkenau. You had them transformed into death camps with the use of Zyklon B and the whole shebang. And they kept this as silent as possible. So beginning in 1942, you started seeing Jews still being deported from the Warsaw Ghetto in Russia. And then when they invaded Hungary, same thing. All these Jews were being transported to these extermination camps, and most of them were killed within hours of arriving. And then, of course, the campaign in Russia isn't doing so well. You had Eichmann being transferred between Russia, Germany, Austria, and then when they did invade Hungary. He also spent some time in Czechoslovakia and Prague, and then when they did invade Hungary in 1944, he was stationed there, and that was his sole job, to coordinate the deaths of millions of Jews. And he did it. He wrote the logistics, the train routes, the blueprint, made sure that they had the supplies they needed to take care of it. Yeah, he was a bureaucrat, but he was a bureaucrat with pure evil intentions. But of course, the war wasn't going so great. You had the Soviet Union joining with the other allies and beginning to make a push towards Germany on both sides, and things weren't going so well. Plus, you had Heinrich, who was assassinated in 1942. He's gone. So, yeah, you had all of this still happening, but Eichmann kept on his job. He kept his head down and kept going. By December of 1944, pretty much Himmler, Keitel, everybody that was involved with the Nazi hierarchy had already ordered that the extermination of Jews stop. And now it was all about hiding the evidence. But even though he had been given orders to stop, Eichmann kept going until he absolutely couldn't. He coordinated an additional 70,000 Jews from Hungary to be gassed. Even when the Third Reich began blowing up the concentration camps, demolishing the concentration camps, he organized forced marches of the survivors and pushed them closer to Germany, because some of the Nazi elite had decided they wanted to hold some of these Jews for ransom and use them as a bargaining chip to, save their own pathetic skins. But finally, with the declaration of victory in Europe by the Allies, it all fell apart. By this point, Eichmann and his family had fled to Austria, and they were living there by May of 1945. He was captured by U.S. forces and spent time in a prison camp for SS officers. He used forged papers that identified him as Otto Eichmann, a totally different name, and he was put on a work detail from which he escaped from Cham, Germany. He then realized that people did know who he was and he needed to get out, so he basically was able to hide out in a village in Germany for several years under a different name. Also, he was able to live there until 1950, believe it or not. You had the Nuremberg trials starting and in full swing by now, and you had other Nazis such as Rudolf Hess and others giving them all kinds of damning information about Eichmann. In 1948, he had obtained a landing permit for Argentina and finally got false identification under the name Ricardo Klimt, and then was able to get out of Germany on June 17, 1950, and arrived in Buenos Aires, Argentina on the 14th of July that same year. He did initially desert his family so that he could get out. Now, remember, Argentina had a Nazi sympathizer government under the Perón, so when you watch Evita, they're not all sunshine and roses. And he was able to not only receive a Buenos Aires identification, he was able to get a job, and eventually was able to build a house at 14 Garibaldi Street, which they moved into in 1960. He was working at the Mercedes-Benz plant in Buenos Aires. He was also able to get his wife and children over there, where their fourth son was born. While living in Argentina, he ran his mouth to documentarians, to biographers, and to the press, and was actually recorded saying things like he knew what was happening to the Jews. Like, his defense prior to that had always been he was just following orders. He was a bureaucrat. He was just organizing, purchasing orders and inventory orders and logistics, the same excuse a lot of the Nazis used. But in these recordings, he actually said he knew where the Jews were going, what was happening to them. He didn't care about the Jews deported to Auschwitz, whether they lived or died. It was the Führer's orders. He said the Jews that were fit to work were allowed to work. Those that weren't were sent to the final solution. He also said that he did not feel any guilt or remorse about what he did. And some of those recordings got out, and you can imagine how it made certain people very, very angry. Now, of course, by this time, the nation of Israel exists, and part of its government operations is an office known as the Mossad, which are basically Nazi hunters. They were made up of veterans, of Jews that had survived the Holocaust, and Eichmann was very high on their list, and they started a sting operation to find him. And eventually, they were able to locate him in Argentina in 1960. Mainly because one of Eichmann's sons started dating a German girl that had been raised in Argentina since way before the war, and her father happened to be of Jewish descent. I guess they didn't do their background checks very well, but he turned his ass in so quickly. And basically, the Mossad sent a kidnapping team in March of 1960 to bring Eichmann back to Israel. On May 11th, 1960, they watched him as he left for work. They monitored work once he got out of work and went to the bus station. They followed him. They had observed his routine for many days, so they knew exactly where he was going to be. They finally saw him get off one of the buses, and one of the Mossad agents engaged him, speaking in Spanish, and they just asked him if he had a moment. When Eichmann turned and began to speak to him in Spanish, he was jumped. And they basically wrestled Eichmann to the ground. It was late, so no one saw, and then they moved him to a car where they hid him on the floor under a blanket. They took him to a Mossad safe house, and he was held there for 9 days. They made sure it was actually Adolf Eichmann. And then they drugged him and took him to the airport and told them they dressed him like a flight attendant, told the flight attendant that he was, had gotten a little too happy on his leave and they were just taking him home, and they flew him to Israel. And the Argentinian government pretty much raised a stink, saying they wanted him back. This was a violation of so many things, but guess what Israel did? They gave them the big old middle finger. United States CIA documents released in 2006 showed that both West Germany and the United States knew where Eichmann was this entire time, and because they had more important things on their mind, like Operation Paperclip, bringing Nazi scientists over to work on our nuclear program and space program so that we could compete with the Soviets, that wasn't high up on their state of affairs. They also worried what this would do to international relations. So there you go. Yeah, don't ever fully trust any government. But anyway, he was tried in Jerusalem, and where he threw up the defense that he did not know what was going on. He was, didn't look like the devil incarnate. He was just this sad little man with glasses that kind of looked like a geek. And he was eventually found guilty. His wife was allowed to come over and visit him one last time. And then he was officially executed June 1st, 1962. Now, this is after exhausting a ton of appeals all the way up to the Israeli Supreme Court. His last words were, "Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria." And there you go. The end of one of the most evil people in all the world, in all history. I hope you enjoyed that. And until next time, 𝗙cie 𝗹𝗵𝗁.